Welcome, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Griffin O'Shaughnessy, the founder and CEO of Canopy Advisory Group. Nice to see all of you. We're just continuing to let a few people in. So give us a minute and then we will go ahead and get started here. At Canopy, we help organizations build teams, as most of you know. We consider ourselves a high-level, on-demand talent firm, and we're there to foster growth, accelerate performance, and tackle organizational challenges with our network of top-tier professionals. Part of this vision we have at Canopy includes connecting all of you, our broader community, with some of our incredible experts, like Keith Harding, who is our guest this morning. Sorry, Keith Down. I'm just looking. Keith Downham, our guest this morning.
All right, I've been called a lot worse, so.
Yeah, exactly. Sorry, I'm like I must have typed the wrong thing
But
here.
especially at budgeting season, I get called a lot worse. So.
For sure. Uh, as many of you know, Keith is one of our highly experienced fractional CFOs. He's worked in finance throughout his career at many top organizations, including Arthur Andersen, Northwestern University, DIA, and the North Highland Company. And now, as a fractional expert, Keith works primarily with growing companies, and he uses his creative problem-solving skills to help them scale. We would love for this to be an interactive conversation. As we were kind of chuckling this morning, we feel like budgeting, as important as it is, doesn't really, get people out of bed in the morning like, oh, I can't wait to learn about budgeting. So we're going to keep this as lively as we can. Please feel free to ask questions, turn off your camera, say hello, throw them in the chat, whatever feels most comfortable to you. We'll be sure to monitor the chat. But just wanted to say welcome and thank you to Keith. We're so excited to have you here today and hosting our webinar. Thanks so much.
Sure. Hi everybody, nice to meet you. I'm Keith Downham. Yeah, we were chuckling. I think I've got hopefully everybody can see the first slide, changing the budgeting paradigm. I originally actually had this called, why does everybody despise budgeting? And going through it. So that's probably a little bit more accurate, but this seems to be a little bit more professional. So I actually put later on in the presentation, kind of saving the best for last, which probably dates me a little bit, but I put in some Far Side cartoons. So hopefully that can at least bring a little bit of chuckling and all that. And as Griffin had said, feel free to interrupt or tell jokes or anything like that because nobody really wants to get out of bed for budgeting. And
No, we're
yeah, just a little bit about
ready
myself
to learn
and yeah, and learn.
here.
That's actually one of the key points through budgeting is you got to learn. But yeah, no, I've been all around the world. I've built organizations domestically and abroad. I've done strategy for United Airlines, consulting with I think she mentioned North Highland, but A.T. Kearney as well, and Anderson, and then I went out in the industry. I built at DIA, I built their FP&A group. We had a bit broader mission than just your typical FP&A, and then I had revenue responsibility and all that. It's kind of one of those things where, when you have an opportunity to build something like that in an organization that's that old. But anyway, and it affords me now with all the my eclectic group of experiences and training and all that to work with some really interesting firms, smaller. I've also done Fortune 5, Fortune 2, Fortune whatever. So, and it's all the same when you get to budgeting. Nobody likes it. Everybody gets angry about it. But it's kind of one of those necessary evils. But if you change the paradigm on what budgeting is, then it may be helpful in rethinking about how you approach budget and all that. And I'd be remiss if I didn't say that I was also a little bit of a modeling geek. I do like Excel. Most people just kind of roll their eyes when I say that, but it's true. I swear I'm fun at parties, at least sometimes anyway. You know, We kind of talked about, or I already kind of mentioned that budgeting is really, it's the world's most boring subject, I think, in a lot of ways. And in fact, as we were talking through this, I'm like, yeah, I don't know, maybe budgeting would be, this presentation would be done better in the fall when everybody's kind of thinking through the budget. But the key is that it is really strategically important. I mean, a lot of people think about it, it's like, well, it's something I got to do. It's numbers that I have to put on the page, and I'm not hired for this. And we'll talk about all those things. But really, budgeting is kind of a key intersection point for strategy and finance, and really it embodies the purpose. And strategy and finance, of course, they need each other. You could say two sides of the same coin or whatever you want to talk about, but really, I always view finance as kind of the common language that you can convert a story and other things that you want to do into reality. And I'm fond of, I came up with this quote, what you see on the slide, it's really on the fly. And it's true, right? Because if you have strategy, yeah, I want to do all these things, but it's really until you put pencil to paper that you can really figure out whether or not it's doable. Kind of like I don't know if anybody here has seen the movie Horizon. Yeah, you've kind of got a mess of a story, and you're not really sure. The parts of the story are all structured pretty well, but you have no idea what the actual plot is by the end of the movie. Or even because I am an old guy, Cannonball Run, interesting plot, but you're just like, my God, I don't know what the heck is going on here. So that's why the two really need each other as we go forward. And I talked a little bit about purpose and strategy and finance, and budget really is the intersection of those two. I mean, think of purpose as, why we exist, and strategy is kind of what we want to do, and finance really is, can we do it? Well, the budget then embodies all those different aspects of your organization, of where you want to go, and what you want to do. I think, if a budget is done well, you should be able to pick up a budget, look at it, read it, understand it, and be able to pick out, maybe not specific words, but generally pick out what it is that your organization is all about, um, and where you're headed. Um, you know, it really is about investing and understanding. And it's funny because I don't know if anybody here has seen the movie Air. Has anybody seen that? I don't see anybody on camera, but
No.
I saw it. So it's all about the advent of the Air Jordan,
Yes,
right?
I was gonna
Nike.
say it's the Nike movie. I've
Yeah,
seen it's
yeah,
great.
that's right.
Great.
That's right. It's the Nike movie. That's right. And they had what's his name? Ben Affleck as Phil Knight,
Uh-huh.
and his buddy, I forget his name, as his chief lieutenant. And I guess it was kind of fortuitous given that this presentation was coming up, because I was looking at it. What was interesting is that there's some pretty important scenes where there's like, well, we've only got this small pot of money, or at least small by today's standards of, I think it was like $250,000, and we need to penetrate the basketball shoe market. And they're going back and forth about what the budget will allow. What's the budget going to do? And we can't do this, we can't do that. Well, then it finally, came through and they were literally talking about the budget. It was actually a critical scene or
Yeah.
critical scene. So I don't know if that's ever
Even
been done
even
in.
Hollywood thought it was worthy, right?
Yeah, well, that's the thing.
Really stand up for a blockbuster.
When has budget ever made the silver screen or whatever it is? But they did, and it was actually a compelling moment. But what they
Yeah.
were doing is that they were going back and forth, and they, about what the budget will allow, and then they finally changed the paradigm that, this isn't about what the budget will allow, it's about what we want to become. And we want to get into the basketball shoe market. We want to dominate the shoe market. And we can't get there by spreading our chips, or, dare I say, our investments among, several mediocre athletes. We can get there maybe if we take one big bet, one big investment, and we put it on Michael Jordan, right? And of course, there's understanding what our organization's all about, and cash flows, and everything else that they talked about. But, they ended up placing the bet. They got Michael Jordan. And I think at the end of the movie, they're like, yeah, they went from, a paltry sum, in revenue every year to the next year selling almost overnight, like $163 million worth of shoes and all that. So, if you start thinking about the budget, about it's really about investing and where you want to place your chips or your bets and really understanding kind of what your organization is all about, then you start to, think through what budget really is and really what it can do for you. Because I mean, at the end of the day, it's just a tool. So as you look on, on this next slide, right, a lot of lines and all that, but really this is, meant to show kind of those two sides of that same coin that, we talked about. And, I'm sure everybody's heard the term top down. I'm sure everybody's heard the term bottom up. The new term on this page is probably negotiations, which we'll talk about, but really it's, your strategic emphasis, right? Do we want to grow internationally? Do we want to be innovation, or are we an innovation firm, high value, or high a startup, high growth firm, right? Well, then if you look at the budget, what you expect to see are investments, right? And I really do like to talk about it, or resource deployment in places like market research and M&A if you want to grow internationally. I mean, probably real estate is probably would be in there, and probably other funds towards joint ventures and all that. If you're an innovative firm, you're probably going to take a look at, or probably see big bets in R&D, maybe even in key talent. High growth startups, which I know there's a probably a fair number of folks that with Canopy that are in that. Of course, I'm sure you've heard from investment banks and all that. It's, all about the marketing and sales and disproportionate amounts there. And then obviously unit economics, making sure that your margins are there, right? And, that's going to be reflected, your strategic emphasis, it's going to have things about, how many cities have we gone into, countries, locations, and all that. But there's also going to be measurements in how is our margin? Are we achieving market dominance and all those kinds of things? One of the keys to the slide, though, is really, and I don't know if my mouse is showing up on the screen, but it's this word negotiations, right? And it really is that, and pending what organization that you're in and what your culture is, it really is about negotiations. Leadership will say, well, we want to make these bets, and then from a bottom up, it's like, well, here's kind of what we need to do in order to get there. And then there's kind of a give and take amongst everybody to kind of figure out, all right, well, if resources are finite, or finance, I guess, but finite, then of course, we have to have put some calls in order to kind of close that gap, right? And this is where the negotiations are just really talking to each other, which is kind of a lost art in some organizations, particularly given that nobody really likes budgeting. But in order to be successful and get to a good outcome and a good end, right? You have to have those discussions. I've been in organizations and they call it, interlocking, which I was like, oh my God, that sounds like some sort of a WWF cage match, or is it WWE now? But whatever it is, that's really where the magic is made, and where you can start to mix your strategy and your finance. The other thing I would say on this page is that, as I was thinking it through, I mean, one of I don't know if it's an epiphany, but one of the things that kind of came to mind is that really there is no quote unquote truly unsuccessful budget. A budget is a tool, and it's going to be reflective of your bet, right? So if you were to go on and look and say, oh, well, Blockbuster had, they had a bad budget because of, they're no longer in business, Netflix ate their lunch and all that. And I suspect that if you were to look at their budget was probably right on. The fact is, they just made a bad bet, right? I think just to bring back movies, if you look at Moneyball, the Oakland A's were like, well, I mean, even if we could afford somebody in this, or even if we could get somebody to replace these players, could we even afford them, right?
Mhm.
Well, they ended up changing how they were looking at their overall budget and how they were looking at their overall talent acquisition strategy. And that's kind of really what we're talking about here. With Quiznos, they stressed out and they had too much growth, really put their franchisees in a bad spot. And it's not because their budget was wrong. Their budget reflected an incorrect strategy. So thinking about the budget as a tool and not necessarily, the end all be all, that's really how the proper framing, I think, from a budgeting perspective. And then as you think through the budget, right, I mean, there's all these different things on here, right? The key to me, and, with all the clients that I work with, always have, and, going forward, it's really all about thoughtfulness, right? Are you being thoughtful, right? And in some ways it's, I don't know if anybody here has been on through case interviews or anything like that, but it's less about the actual answer and more about how did you get there? What's your thought process? But thoughtfulness in this vein, particularly with budgeting, it helps drive accountability and ownership. I think everybody kind of knows what that is, right? But if you think about informed decision making, right, have we thought through, right, what could happen to the market? Have we thought through, how we will act and react, right? And these two in particular, oops, it's not highlighting, but informed decision making and risk management, if you think about it, those two are very, very related. A lot of scenario analysis, thinking through, okay, well, if we do this and we place our bets here and we spend these dollars here, what are the risks? What are we trying to get there? What are our chances of success? All things that you need to think through when you're putting together a strategic plan and, of course, your budget. There's always going to be the measurement aspects. Everybody hates that because you put it down there and, oh my God, what if I'm wrong and all that. But, think about it as learning, forecasting and planning that, it serves as the foundation for that. And then of course, the traditional financial control, this is how we make sure that we're not wasting money and that we are making intelligent bets and thinking through our risks. Um, so how do you do it, right? Honestly, the answer to this, because everybody's like, well, how do I get started, right? It's always that, the hardest part is to get started. And, I think it's a trite phrase from some movie or play or something. But, how do you eat an 8,000 pound elephant? It's one bite at a time, right? So how do you do it? Well, I really like to think about it, and I do realize that at least on this slide, um, even though these are really basic elements and there is no one specific way, I do realize that they are in somewhat of an order. But you don't actually have to do everything in this order. But what's key is just making sure that you touch on all these different categories, right? And generally you like to start with kind of that finance in strategy connection with identifying your strategic goals. What is it that we want to do? And again, the thoughtfulness goes throughout this, right? It's almost kind of like that mini business case for everything that you're doing along all the different stages, getting into identifying your goals, understanding what and estimating what your revenues are. And, remember, it's an estimate, right? We think we can get there, and here's what we need to do to get there. But and I'll make this point later on, but the only thing we know about a budget after you're done is that it's wrong, right? It reflects a lot of thought, and if there's anybody from the military here, what do they say? It's your plan is as good as up until the first bullets are fired, and then it all goes out the window. And that's where, again, the thoughtfulness comes into play. Have you thought it through? Making sure that we understand what kinds of expenses that we have to make sure that we have all our bases covered, allocating resources, and then of course the monitoring and reviewing and evaluating as you go along, right? And a lot of this is about, asking questions, right? Particularly up here in monitor and adjust, review and evaluate. It's not, well, you got it wrong. It's understanding, okay, well, why didn't our numbers come in as we had thought that they would? and what changed. And in some cases it could be there were some magnificent opportunities that came along, so we moved bets and chips and resources to other areas of the organization. But you want to make sure that you understand that as you go along. um, so I'll
Do you
just
do
kind of
that
pause here.
quarterly? Sorry to interrupt, Keith. Do you do that monitor and adjust quarterly typically? Or
you
what's
know
the cadence for that?
yeah, I mean, so it's interesting, right? I think there's different levels of monitoring, right? I think, you want to look at semi-annual, right? So you have a longer period of time, but you also want to look at quarterly. And then if you're in the finance department, you're going to look at monthly, right? It's just, I think, the level and depth that you get to, because each segment there gives you a little bit more trending, a little bit more of insight in terms of what has been happening and where things are going. And obviously, 6 months of worth of data gives you a little bit more information from a trend than 1 month, right? That's just a single data point. So I think it's really the depth, or excuse me, the depth and level that you go to. But I do think that on a monthly basis, you need to keep your finger on the pulse, and you need to analyze and assess, and that's where maybe a lot of your awareness will come from. And then as you get more data, then you can develop the insights on how to adjust. And so thank you for that, Griffin. Are there any questions or anything? I'll just pause here real briefly, see if anybody wants to talk about anything. No.
Just
So
absorb.
this slide, it's a variation of the slide that I actually originally had as the actual title of the presentation. So this is where I thought I would bring in the far side, because hopefully whoever's on, you can get a little bit of a chuckle as you look through this. But I think, everybody hates it, right? It's not fun. Right. And, as you think through, it's like, you could just, I can almost see it on people's faces when I walked around organizations or I'm consulting to, there's just like the stress of like, oh no, here comes the budget, the Jaws music starts, and you're like, oh God, here we go. I'm going to have to add to my job, right? Well, this isn't really my job. But now I have two jobs. I've got to do the budget and all that. I remember I was working with an organization, and and they had some challenges in particular areas. So I had to spend a lot of time with the legal folks. They're like, look, I went to law school. I don't know numbers. I don't know this. I don't know that. And I just can't. I don't want to do this. It's not my job. And, to a certain degree, they're right. But to a certain degree, they're wrong, because nobody's going to know your budget and your aspect of a given strategy like you will. And then, of course, we talked a little bit about, getting it wrong. Right. They're like, okay, well, if I put my numbers on a page, um, you're going to come back and, you're going to start pointing guns at me, fingers if it's wrong. And, then that, of course, all creates all builds up onto the anxiety. So, that's why it's very, very important, particularly for leaders to, remember that, this is an exercise about investments. And did you consider risks? And if the answer is yes, then I think the dynamic or the paradigm of what you're doing changes quite rapidly. Um, this has one of my favorite Far Side, the School for the Gifted. I've always loved
I love
this,
that
but
one. I think because it happens to like everybody.
yeah,
My
right. And
husband did it the other day, and I was like, "Oh my God, you're like the Far Side ad."
yeah, no, absolutely. Well, my other favorite
We're
one is this one
switching.
with the Bears, with this, I think I have that on like a Slack channel. But yeah, no, I love this because, it's like, so Griffin, you're a very intelligent and smart person, but here, your husband, I think you were saying, was giving you a hard time about something. And I don't know, I love this. I think I had a t-shirt on it. And that goes true for, for example, with that organization, I was talking to an attorney. I mean, it's not like the attorney wasn't, intelligent. Very intelligent, but training is not in finance, right? And they're there to do very, very different things. So it's not that they can't get it, it's not that they can't do it. It's just, it's outside of their comfort zone. Or, of course, I've got a couple kids, and, my daughter in particular, although she's wonderful at math, she gets all frustrated with math. She's like, I'm not going to even go anywhere near the business school when I go to college. And I'm like, that's fine, but she's a smart lady. Or a smart young lady, that is. But she can do it. It's just, really helping to understand, helping to frame it correctly and putting people at ease. There's obviously the two time consuming. I'm not here to do budget. I'm here to do this other thing. And, why don't we just have somebody down the line or somebody else do it and, we'll deal with that way. And, let's face it, the tactical aspect of budgeting, right? Unless you're like me and you like Excel and you like finance and you like that, I mean, it's pretty boring. And, I'll be honest, even as a finance guy, yeah, it can be pretty darn boring because it's, there's a lot of tedium that goes into it. So, it really comes down to, particularly if you're leading an organization, how do you alleviate that stress, right? And I think all the different things that we talked about, right? Haven't done it before, boring, getting it wrong. I mean, it really does lead up to the anxiety that we talked about on this page, which, has its own. So, as I was preparing this presentation, I was kind of looking around and, trying to think of different ways to frame certain aspects of budgeting. And this one, I'd never actually seen this quote before, so hopefully AZ Quotes is correct. But even if he didn't say it, I'm going to use it anyway and attribute it to him. The thing about this page that I like is that budgeting, can very much, part of the reason why it becomes painful is that there's so many activities that can get involved in budgeting that really aren't necessary, that it just makes it painful, it makes it boring. So, it's really all about finding, having clear expectations, right? And keeping everything in perspective and balance, right? So it's one of those things where, I've worked with clients who are like, well, why don't we do an analysis on this? Or why don't we do an analysis on that? And you're like, well, all right, let's take a step back and let's think about, okay, is it really going to change the answer if we put, a few more chips here or a few more chips there? Is it going to change how our budget supports our organization, the messages that it sends, the type of risks that we're mitigating? And if the answer is no, then just leave it alone. And I think that can, that's probably true for, everybody's heard the term analysis paralysis, but that's probably true across the organization. But I think in particular, it comes in the budget because everybody gets so anxious. I got to get it right, or I'm going to have bunny rabbits shooting guns at me, that they ended up doing that, which is why you really need to help turn down the temperature for budgeting, right? And some of the keys to do that, again, remember, you're evaluating investments, not people. Right. And this is another one. I don't know if Griffin, it sounds like you like the Far Side too, but I swore I wouldn't read captions on this, but I like it. But basically, these cows are pointing at this other one on a grill saying that, you're sick, sick, sick. Right. They're evaluating him. But, in budgeting, it's not about evaluating the person. It's just evaluating the investment. And it could be, and some people may take it personally that, well, we're not going to grant this request or that request in a budget. And it's not a personal thing. What it is about we need to put our resources in these other areas to make sure that we can achieve our objectives. Talk to each other, right? I mean, it's shocking in the number of, and again, I mean, on the other hand, I guess maybe it's not shocking. So I'm going to talk out of both sides of my mouth, but it's shocking the amount of people just don't talk, right? And I think some of it has to do with the fact that, well, I don't really want to do this, and if I talk to people, then it's going to elongate my suffering through budgeting. But really, it's talking to each other, right? Can eliminate, I don't know, maybe 85% of the challenges in a budget, versus doing it in a silo where you then create additional work for trying to get rid of duplication and all that. But talking to each other is so key. We talked earlier on an earlier slide about the negotiations aspect. This is really, really, really important. That's where you can bring the finance side and the strategy side together. Um, Artificial level of precision. This is something that, I've said throughout my career. Um, and it's, all I'm trying to get at when I say, beware of the artificial level of precision is that, the only thing we know at the end of the day is that it's wrong, right? And you can spend all sorts of time toiling over your budget, right? But is it really going to change the answer? And if the answer is no, move on, right? Make sure that you're reasonable, make sure that you've thought it through, you've considered all the risks, right? But if it's not going to change the answer, then stop and submit and talk. That's what's going to help you. That's what's really going to help focus the organization on the strategic issues that finance is trying to put into a common language versus continually trying to nibble, well, we have a dollar here and a dollar there, right? Don't worry about, you know, changing assumptions by $50. Worry about should we even be spending money in these areas? Right. And we talk a little bit about, where's finance's role? One of the fallacies out there is that, well, that's finance's job, right? Going back to the bears, it's somebody else's responsibility. It's really everybody's responsibility. But, one of the things that finance can do is that they can share templates, right? They can provide feedback. They can uh, be true teammates, right? And recognize, what the skill sets are throughout the organization, right? And communication, timelines. Some people, they need to know when something is going to be due, what they have to provide. The easier that you can make or that finance can make for organizations to accomplish the budget, the more successful, the least painful, and the more engaging, right? The talking to each other, the more meaty those conversations can be versus some of the more tactical things that are out there. Um, so tips, right? And we've talked about a lot of these already. I've tried to weave them throughout the presentation. So I'll probably hit on just a few of these. Starting in with strategy, I think we've kind of talked about that quite a bit. It's about the journey, right? What are your assumptions? How did you get to your level of budget request or the bet that you want to make? This is a famous quote. I think it was from Peter Drucker, Culture Eats Strategy for Breakfast. Culture is so important. It permeates the organization. And so when you say what's the right way to do a budget, right? It's got to match how your organization operates. A Fortune 5 is going to approach budgeting, and they're also going to have probably a lot more data than a very small startup or somebody that's in high growth that is experiencing stages of growth that they've never been in before, right? But it's important to make sure that you understand what your culture is because that's going to help dictate your approach and how you go about doing your budget. OpEx, the silent killer, right? Organizations that, run into particularly operating margin problem, it's death by $1,000, by 1,000 paper cuts, right? It's 1,000 increases of $1 or $1,000 here and there that your budget all of a sudden gets out of control, or it reflects spending patterns that are unsustainable. I think is how I should have said that for your overall organization, right? So it's always important to revisit, right, why you're doing something, not, and I always hate this phrase with all the teams that I've either managed or consulted to. Well, we've always done it that way, right? I even had somebody once, they're like, well, there were really no good impacts of, from zero-based budgeting. I'm like, no, I don't buy that because over time, right? If you're just adding on each and every year, which a lot of organizations do, I wouldn't advise it. But if you're just starting with a baseline and growing from there, at some point you need to really justify why you're doing certain things. Reporting, we talked a little bit about that. And then finally, the standard, right? There is no standard for how you do it. That's why I frame that slide from earlier. It's about elements, right? But how you do it, right? The templates that you use, the ordering, when you have discussions, who are in discussions, that's going to be, and even technology, right? I was even thinking about, well, what if somebody asks, like, what about technology, right? And technology is obviously an important part, but it's going to be reflective of, what do you use for your GL? What do you use for, or how do you approach your budget, right? And making sure that it all fits together. There is no actual standard. So don't stress out that you're not doing it right because there is no quote unquote right and wrong on how to do it. Um, So that's about it. Probably should have set expectations up front. This isn't really about this presentation isn't meant to get into the weeds so much, but it is meant to really talk about principles and all that. So I guess I'll just kind of pause there and open it up if there are any. I think I don't know how we're doing on time, Griffin.
Yeah, we're
Hopefully I
perfect.
didn't go
Perfect.
on
We've got
too
time
long.
for some questions. I'll ask a couple as everyone, kind of thinks through if they have questions as well. But you mentioned technology. Are there ways, and I like your emphasis on the strategy piece of it, and it's about what we want to become. I think that makes it less boring to me. I think that's a good point, is the boredom is kind of probably a lot of what people don't like about it. But when you
Yeah.
focus on the bigger picture and you start with that and you end with
hmm
that, I think that certainly helps. But when you do have to get tactical, kind of in the middle, are there ways AI can help? Are there technology tools you found? Or you also mentioned zero-based budgeting as sort of not your preference. Can you talk through, if that's not the best way,
Well,
a little bit,
yeah. So, oh, sorry, go
how do you
ahead.
build a budget and what tools do you use other than, if you don't have a big team supporting you?
Yeah, yeah. I think it's interesting. So yes, I mean, there's 1,000 tools out there, and it's funny. I did a couple searches and just like, it'd be interesting that, there's like 1,001 software tools out there. It's like, well, we're for big organizations, we're for small.
Mhm.
At the end of the day, I think budgeting software is, a dime a dozen. It's really going to fit into what works well with your system. And because of how I like to do things, and the fact is that a lot of people are just really familiar with Excel. I always
Right.
want to make sure that there's some sort of an Excel download that you can get to because when all else fails, you just give them the Excel, put your data in here. So you want to
Mhm.
make sure that you can upload it or download it. In terms of, I think AI is permeating, everything, leaps and bounds. And I think, much like you can use chat GPT to write speeches or, well, presentations or things like that, right? It's an aid. It can give you ideas, it can make suggestions, but at the end of the day, it's not going to replace, at least not right now anyway, the intelligence, the know-how, the institutional knowledge, the gut that people have for how to really achieve the end that they need.
Mhm.
um, so, and just to clarify on zero-based budgeting, I'm not saying that it's good or bad, nor am I saying baseline budgeting is good or bad or any other. They all have their place. And I think, if you've never done zero-based, then I'd say it's probably a good activity to do because really what zero-based does is it makes you go back and challenge all the inherent assumptions that you're no longer challenging, right? It's
Mhm.
that whole notion of, well, we've always done it that way, which just it makes me chafe with everybody that, with anybody I consult with or talk to or whatever, because you haven't really put any thought into whether it's still necessary. Right. Now, doing it every year, yeah, sure. I mean, the utility of that may go down over time. You do it 2, 3 years in a row, it's still like, okay, well, we already know because we just revisited it. So that's where it comes into play that there is no one right way to do it. It's just making sure that what you're trying to achieve and using, the right methods, the right approach for what fits your organization.
Okay. We've got a question from Jeff.
Hey,
Go ahead.
Jeff.
Yeah, not necessarily a question, but a comment, Keith. I think you hit on it several times throughout the presentation here, but I think it's an underrated topic and one that a lot of companies miss, and that's the communication process as
Oh,
part of the
yeah.
budgeting process. And again, you touched on
Uh-huh.
it like on the lowering the temp for budgeting on those slides. I've seen it seems like when you have a more well thought out communication plan, there's less frustration once you're presenting the budget and what has to be acted on. So I've done budgeting processes with a lot of companies. I've screwed it up enough times. And it
Yeah.
just seems with well thought out communication, you avoid some of those or you lower the frustration and it seems to be easier to get buy-in. So I think you hit the nail
100%.
on the head on those comments.
Yeah, and I like to frame it, or the terminology I use is, take people along for the ride, right? Make them a part of it,
Yeah.
right? Don't scold them, like, up here within, evaluate the investment. But yeah, you're right. And I think, and it's funny. because when you say that, the first thing that came to my mind when you said it was like change management, right? Change management 101 is all about, it starts with communication. Then I think the second thing you do is communicate. And then probably the third thing you do is communicate. And then you do other things for change management, right? And I think you're right with budgeting, it's kind of the same thing. And it's also just I mean, how many times have you been in an organization or, with some of your people, they start whipping out, well, the chasm is this and the rasm is that. And you're like, okay, it's almost like they're going out of their way to confuse you, to tell you how smart they are. It's really just making sure it's also about communicating in terms that people understand. So putting things in perspective. And, a lot of times I'm like, I just recognizing that, look, everybody here is smart. It's just my training is in finance, your training is in something else, but you probably do all these things on a daily basis and you don't even know it. So yeah, 100%. I couldn't agree more. And I think having that communication plan and then supplementing it, right? With templates, right? That kind of teamwork that we talked about, providing feedback and all that. I think that all, communicate expectations and timelines. So there's another one, right? I think you're 100% right, Jeff. And the other thing, and I actually had it on here and I skipped over it, so I'll just come back to it. You said that you went through a bunch of organizations, and I'm going to paraphrase what you said, but you're like, well, I screwed up 1,000 times or what, whatever it was that you said. The key to all or well, one of the keys anyway, it's learn, right? Learn, learn, learn,
Yeah.
right? And there's no harm in learning throughout a budget process. That's how you get better in any number of things. And I think that applies to budgeting too.
I think it's such a good conversation, and I think you hit on it, but it's what I've seen is the balance between sending off the service lines, okay, go create whatever your wish list budget is, and then come back, and then the executive team or the finance team will say, well, this is way too much, and cut it down, versus something that's more like I think about the IRS of like you have to sort of guess, and then they tell you that you're wrong, and then that's how that your taxes end up working. I just to your point about it, there's there not being one right way is like I've seen that work poorly because the teams don't when they're putting the wish list budget together, they think, well, what's the point of doing this? Because it's just going to get cut back and I don't know what the parameters are. And so I'm just going to either make a wild guess and then we'll cut it back, or I'm going to ask for $2 million more than I actually need. And so I think there's pros and cons to like you're saying, but the communication aspect of so it doesn't feel like it's a siloed process is such an important point.
Well, that's right. And look, I mean, this is, I don't know how many slides it is, right? But there's definitely a lot of nuance and specifics, and you're 100% correct, right? And when you get that, it is more complex than just saying, hey, we want to be an international, we want to grow internationally, so show me a budget that does it. You should be able to read it and see that, all right, well, we're clearly making bets over here. But, from a top-down perspective, yeah, I mean, they've got to provide a lot more guidance about, what we're expecting. Because you're right, if you don't provide enough, then people are going to be like, well, yeah, I'm all right, fine. Well, then I want, $500 million to do X, Y, and Z. And it's like, well, that's not going to be realistic. Or where do I have it on one of these slides? Thought I did. Reasonable, right? Yeah. That's not going to be reasonable either. So, but that again is where some of this, I called it negotiations for the purposes of the slide, but that's where some of the questions and answers come back, right? And, people up here may get annoyed, like, oh, don't you already know? Well, again, that's why you have to turn down the temperature and realize that not everybody's going to know or interpret what you're saying or what your parameters are the same way, right? So you have to be there, right, to work with them in a team. Where's my teamwork? Well, it's on here somewhere, but work as a team, right, to get to that end.
So no one's like trying to game the system, right? So being like, okay, if I'm going to try to work this so I get the most budget possible, or versus, what you're saying is like we're all in this together, and so kind of the education thing you're talking about of like helping people understand why finance and why the executive team is making the decisions that they are, the final decisions, how that checklist actually works, and then the business people in the business can say, okay, I understand what we're all working toward the same goal, so I need to I need to have my budget set up in a way that's going to get us closest to those goals without taking an undue amount of risk. I just think that seems like common sense, but that's not how it's worked in the organizations that I've been in.
Yeah, and that's right. And I think, framing it in risk, but also, as you said, framing it in terms of the investment, right? So that people have a why about what we're doing, right? I mean, my God, people, in fact, when I was working at one company, I'm like, people will put up with 1,001 different things if you just communicate, if you just explain, if you give some of the background, right? People will be like, oh, okay, I get it. All right, I'm on board, right? Or even if they're not on board, they at least still get what the objective is. But if you don't communicate those kind of key, you don't, those kind of, if you don't communicate those key aspects, right? I mean, as part of the communication plan or whatever, that's going to be, you're dooming yourself to a lot more painful process, right? The far more evil than necessaries than you need to. So, 100%, 100%.
Heath, I have a question. With like the current economy or just in general, when companies that you work with have to cut budgets, is there an area that you see that just like always goes first, or does it
No.
really depend or?
Well, yeah. Well, I mean, is it always? I mean, there's no manual that says, all right, in case of, emergency, break glass and, cut. But I mean, of those that generally are on the chopping block, it's always marketing,
Yeah,
right?
right.
I mean, that's just the one that everybody's like, all right, well, we don't have to spend money on commercials. We can, and actually, I'm glad you asked that question because I was just having a conversation this week, and I'm not a big fan of that because it's almost like, cutting off your nose to spite your face, right? I mean, the way to grow, or one of the ways to grow, is through marketing, selling, right? Getting people to buy your product, right? The key is, you just want to examine and make sure that, if you haven't done this already, you just want to make sure you're getting the biggest bang for your buck, and maybe things that were a little bit more marginal in terms of utility, or maybe things that were a little bit more marginal in terms of being able to tie it into a surefire, this is going to help us grow our sales. You want to be, I think, a little bit more surgical. I mean, there's some organizations be like, all right, well, let's cut 5% everywhere. Well, that doesn't really do anything, right? Because you may be cutting, bone and muscle as well as fat. So, but yeah, I mean, the straight answer to your question is, yeah, a lot of people look at marketing. I would argue that that's probably not I mean, certainly you want to look there, but it's not, just go into marketing and take it. You want to be very thoughtful, right? So kind of going back to the slide here about thoughtfulness, you want to be thoughtful about what you're doing, which then again gets everybody groaning like, oh God, even for when I want to cut, I have to put some thought into it and, and all that. But, that's how you accomplish what you need to do in the right way so that you can minimize the risk of cutting off your nose to spite your face.
Thank you.
Yeah. And I mean, obviously, I have a bias on that as a marketing person, but I think that's a big challenge for marketers in some of these other areas where you're making investments that are going to pay off in the long term. So they're supposed to pay off in the longer term, like brand is very hard to quantify, right? And so you want to say, okay, we're going to try to generate X level of awareness and engagement, and then this should lead to X, which a conversation with the finance team, if I'm a finance person, is saying, well, okay, no, do instead, do this performance marketing because look, I can put exact number of dollars in and then I can get, some level of ROI out. I personally think that some of those calculations are skewed and it's a little bit more of like trying to measure something that's difficult to quantify. But I think it's a good point on just like really it should be on marketing and these other areas to make the case that not everything's going to drive a sale immediately, but here based on the portfolio of what's available in the budget, here's kind of this I guess balance between like this is what's going to help us in the long term and this is going to help us right now. and try to make the case to the finance and executive team that you need to be doing both. And here's what can happen if you don't.
Yeah, and it's funny because you said, well, it's on the marketing team, right? I would actually say, yeah, I mean, it is, but it's on every team. But more importantly, and this may be an area where, at least I've been told in the past, this kind of makes me a little bit of an oddball finance guy, is that it's also on the finance team to realize that, the world is bigger than just your spreadsheet, right? You've got to consider the fact that, yeah, okay, well, the numbers say, right? And what are numbers? They're just based upon assumptions that may or may not be right. But the numbers say, well, we should cut here, cut there, or, whatever it may be. The finance team has to be strategic enough as well to say, all right, yeah, I mean, we may be able to find, some areas that we can economize here. Um, but they need to be cognizant of the fact that, at least when I was in MBA school, in fact, I remember when I was in getting my MBA, I talked to, and I was at a heavy marketing school, extremely well known for that. And I talked to I'm a numbers guy, right, quote unquote, or partly anyway. And, I was talking to the head of marketing and I'm like, okay, well, there's got to be some formulas, something there must be, right? That can tie if you spend $1 in marketing that you get, $10 back, or, that whole money machine that, like a VC firm might use when they're, you're pitching. And she gave me a formula, and I'm sitting there looking, and she's like, yeah, that's about all we have. Now, granted, the world has evolved since, I developed these gray hairs and all that. But, I think the concept is still the same, is that it is hard to make those clear connections other than, all right, we have a campaign, what happened to our revenue, and can we kind of, or can we kind of look to see, all right, well, did it help? Did it not help? All that, but that of course is after the fact. So, marketing in a lot of ways is one of those areas where you are making a big bet. You don't know if it's going to be successful, but I do think that the onus, and largely I think, is on the finance team to not think in a tunnel vision traditional finance point of view.
I love hearing that.
Yeah, I'm sure you do. Yeah, like a lot of people like to hear that, but
Well, thanks a lot, Keith. We've had, I think, some engaging discussion. I love all the movie quotes. Thanks for making it fun and bringing in some humor. And budgeting is a reality that, most of us have to face. And so breaking it down like this, I think, has been super helpful. If
Well, you're
any,
very welcome, and I'm
yeah,
available for birthday parties and weddings too. So, let me
perfect.
know. I can.
I like that. Yeah, we'll use that for sure. But if any of you can utilize key support in your organization, or you have a connection or a colleague that could, please reach out and let us know. As you can see, he breaks it down in a way that is helpful, but keeps it fun and keeps it to the focused on the point of, where do we want to be as an organization? And that's the part that I really like about it. So thank you. Really happy you could be here this morning.
Well, thank you. Much appreciated.
All right. We'll stick around if anyone has any other questions. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thanks. Did you want me to stick around, Griffin, or?
Well, it looks like I think everybody got their questions asked. So just in
Okay.
case has one, somebody kind of lingers to chat a little, but thank you. That was great. I loved it. So helpful,
Good.
and a lot of really good takeaways. And I think there was really, great engagement.
Well, good. Hey, so since, you guys have you guys seen this cartoon? Well, you probably had. Let me see if I can.
We have the big Far Side, like it's like the big thick book of them.
This one was just cracking me up. Suddenly he exchange took place between the
Right?
king and the moat
Did it
contractor.
on the wrong side.
Yeah.
I know.
Sorry.
I know.
That guy is the most brilliant
Right?
cartoonist.
I know. So genius. I love it.
Yeah.
It's so creative to tie all those into the different points. I thought it was so cute.
Yeah.
It'll make for
Did
some
you
good.
how's your place in Florida is good, or?
It's good. Thanks for asking. Yeah, it's pretty much, we've repaired from the hurricanes, and the only problem is we just can't get down there very much. We're like, when can we go? Oh, never. maybe
Yeah,
some,
that's the
no.
temp. Yeah.
Oh my gosh, it's really hard, but it's all great and it's there waiting, when we can
Well,
go.
good for you. I'm glad. And then you
Yeah,
also, did I hear you say that you're moving out? You had to move out of your house
we
because you were
did. Oh
like,
my gosh. We're in a rental now in Wash Park. We're doing a big, finished that construction project and now doing a big construction project on our house here. So
oh,
it's
geez.
really a doozy this spring so far, but it's all good.
Yeah, I had a really good friend of mine, and they bought an older house, maybe like yours. I don't know if your house is older or not,
Ours
but
is
his
28. It was
what's that?
it was built in the 20s, like
Oh
way.
yeah, so
Yeah.
his was at least then, maybe even slightly older, right? But the same kind of concept, right? Like one bathroom, all that.
Yeah.
And they finally made the decision like, all right, we're gonna go all in. We're gonna actually have an actual house. We put in multiple bathrooms and they did all this
Right.
stuff. So they had to move out. And when they moved out, of course there's plastic, covering the house and all this stuff. And then one of those freak Denver, Colorado storms came through, flooded the house,
Oh no.
ruin their stuff and all that. And it was funny because I was like, Rob, are you okay? Is there, and he had a wonderful take on it. He's like, you know what, at the end of the day, it's just stuff.
No.
Nobody was hurt, nobody, anything like that. And that's kind of one of those things that stuck with me that yeah, at the end of the day, it's just a material possession. So
Exactly. It's hard to have that perspective, but so smart. I know. You got to just kind of be a wave with these processes,
yeah,
Wave,
and
bring,
yeah,
bring it down drama, and it's like, okay,
yeah.
write it out. We'll get there. We'll get there.
Yeah, this is my client. I'm just like, listen, I mean, you could put in the world's best process. You could put in the world's best, whatever. And I'm like, the key to remember is that things are still going to go wrong. Just
Totally.
it's
Yeah,
gonna happen. It's not if, it's when,
right.
right? All you're doing
Right.
is trying to
Yeah.
minimize. You're trying to minimize,
Yeah.
bad things happening or whatever. And it's like with your house, right? I mean, you're just trying to minimize, but yeah,
Exactly. Well,
yeah.
thanks again. Sorry, I've got to jump into an interview here at 10. So
Oh, yeah, yeah. No, I'm here for you.
cheers,
So, all
but
right. Well, if we're
that was
done, Mel,
awesome.
Thanks,
great.
Okay.
Keith.
Yeah,
Well, I
we'll
hope
send
that
you
was
the video
helpful.
and we'll send a follow-up to everybody with the link and yeah.
Okay.
You
Do
just
you
keep
Great.
want
in touch.
the PowerPoint version?
Please,
Great.
So I'll
if you
give that
send to
to
me,
you.
yep,
My
that'd be
my only
wonderful.
advice to you is just if you're gonna post it, I don't know how the copy. Well, actually, Griffin, you're an attorney. I don't know how the copyrights work on this stuff.
We
So
won't
it may,
post it. We'll just send a copy to those that
Yeah,
RSVP,
and
that
yeah,
were here, those that
yeah.
attended. But we
So
won't post.
it's up to you. Otherwise, I was gonna say you
Yeah.
could just put like a blank, just a box like picture removed on each one of them or something like that. So up to you. So, but I just
Okay.
FYI.
All right.
thanks,
Well,
Keith.
All right,
thank you.
great guys. Hey, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
It was great. Thanks for
All
doing
right,
it.
thank
Appreciate
you.
it.
Bye
Bye.
bye.